The corridors of history are not quiet places. They whisper, they breathe, and sometimes they remember. Tonight on Haunted Corridors, we're stepping into a story the land itself tried to bury. A story where the swamp became a witness, where a hunted mother refused to surrender, and where a child carried something older than fear inside her eyes. This is not just a tale about slavery. It's not just a story about pursuit. This is about what happens when cruelty walks too far into sacred ground, and the ground answers back. In the American South, there were men who made their living hunting human beings. They trusted dogs, guns, chains, and the belief that power always flows in one direction. But sometimes the hunted does not run blindly. Sometimes she leads you exactly where you're not supposed to go. What you're about to hear was whispered from plantation to plantation, carried through marsh fog and campfire smoke. A story overseers laughed at, until they stopped laughing altogether. So if you believe history still leaves footprints, if you believe the past has teeth, and if you're ready to walk a little deeper into the darkness, make sure you're subscribed to Haunted Corridors, because once this story begins, there's no turning back. The year was 1856, and the atmosphere along the northern coast of Florida was heavy enough to crush the spirit. This was a land where the air itself felt hostile, where salt from the Atlantic tangled with the rot of the marshes, pressing down on every breath like an unseen hand. Here, the border between land and water refused to stay still, shifting with the tides, mirroring the fragile and violent balance of power that ruled the lives trapped beneath it. On the desolate stretch of earth known as the Whitmore Plantation, the nights were usually swallowed by silence, broken only by cicadas rasping like rusted gears or the lonely cry of a heron somewhere in the dark. But on this particular night, something was wrong. The slave quarters were quiet in a way that felt electric, like the moment before a storm splits the sky open. Inside a weather-beaten cabin leaning into the coastal wind, a woman named Celia labored in silence, her body already exhausted by a lifetime of cruelty before the pain of childbirth even began. She was only 22 years old, but the plantation had carved decades into her bones, mapping her back with scars and her hands with calluses earned since childhood. Presiding over the birth was Rue, an elder midwife whose hands carried the memory of 3 generations, hands that knew both medicine and the old spiritual laws that had crossed the ocean in chains. Rue knew immediately this birth was different. The moon had abandoned the sky entirely, leaving a darkness so complete it felt intentional. When Rue tried to light her tallow candle, the flame refused to live, snuffed out again and again by a cold breath that had no source in the sweltering room. So Rue worked by touch alone, reading contractions like Braille, listening to the language of pain and timing, until the child finally entered the world. There was no cry, no desperate gasp for air. The baby simply opened her eyes. Even in the gloom, Rue could see them clearly, bright and unsettling, flecked with gold as if they were catching a light that did not exist. Those eyes held no confusion, no fear, only an ancient calm that made Rue's breath catch in her throat. This was not a blank soul. This was something old, wearing a newborn skin. Celia pulled the child close, and in that moment, something dangerous entered the cabin. Hope. She named the girl Zora, after a grandmother stolen from the Gold Coast, a woman who whispered of power drawn from roots and earth, of survival shaped by hoodoo and will. As Rue looked down at the child cradled against her mother's chest, she felt it deep in her bones. The inheritance had returned. As Zora grew, it became impossible to pretend she was like the other children. From the moment she learned to walk, she carried herself differently, not with arrogance, but with an unsettling certainty, as though the world were something she expected to answer to her rather than crush her beneath it. While the other enslaved children learned early lessons of survival, how to lower their eyes, how to make themselves small, how to disappear when white footsteps approached, Zora never quite absorbed those rules. She looked where she wished. She stood where she pleased. And when spoken to harshly, she did not flinch the way fear demanded. This difference did not go unnoticed in the quarters. The elders watched her with quiet concern, torn between pride and terror, knowing too well how quickly the plantation machine destroyed spirits that refused to bend. Celia felt it too, that tightening knot of dread in her chest every time Zora lifted her chin a little too high or met the overseer's gaze for half a second too long. Because on the Whitmore plantation, defiance was not corrected. It was erased. The moment that sealed Zora's legend came when she was barely 2 years old. Somehow, unnoticed, she wandered away from the quarters and into the main plantation house, a forbidden space where punishment was swift and merciless. She was found in the parlor, sitting on the bench of the grand piano, but she wasn't banging the keys like a child should. Her small fingers pressed them with deliberate precision, producing a slow, broken melody that sounded less like music and more like grief remembering itself. That was when Garrett found her. Garrett, the overseer, a man who took pride in breaking people the way others took pride in craftsmanship, leather-skinned, cold-eyed, convinced that cruelty was efficiency, he reached for the whip at his belt, already sneering, already convinced this lesson would be quick and permanent. "Got to cut the rot out early," he muttered, raising his arm. But the blow never came. Zora stopped playing. She turned her head, and she looked at him. What happened next was whispered about for years. Garrett gasped as if struck in the chest, his face draining of color, his body locking as though invisible iron bands had wrapped around his ribs. He staggered backward, dropping the whip, clawing at the air, drowning in terror no one else could see. The moment he broke eye contact, the pressure vanished. He never struck Zora, never spoke to her again. And from that day forward, the man who feared nothing crossed the road to avoid a toddler. The plantation noticed. Years passed, and the plantation aged Zora faster than time ever should have. By the age of 5, whispers followed her wherever she walked, not spoken aloud, but carried in glances and silences, in the way dogs whimpered when she passed and padlocks seemed to loosen at her presence. Celia felt the danger growing with every season, a pressure building like a storm that had nowhere left to go. What frightened her most was not Zora's difference, but the moment when that difference would stop being tolerated and start being hunted. Rue saw it too. The old midwife began pulling Zora aside in the early hours before dawn, guiding her deep into the woods where the plantation's rules lost their grip. There, beneath dripping moss and half-light, Rue taught her the language that lived beneath the surface of the world. Which roots healed, which roots killed, how the earth listened when spoken to properly. And most importantly, that power was not loud, it was patient. By the autumn of 1861, the world beyond the plantation cracked open with war. The Civil War sent the master's sons riding off in grey uniforms, leaving the estate undermanned but more dangerous than ever. Fear of rebellion tightened patrols. Punishments grew faster, harsher, final. Garrett began watching Zora again, his old terror replaced by something colder, something hungry. Celia recognized that look instantly, and she knew they were running out of time. The final push came from Zora herself. For 3 nights in a row she woke screaming from visions soaked in blood and lantern light. Men, chains, bodies in the dirt. On the 3rd morning she looked at her mother with eyes that felt far older than her small face. "We have to go tonight," she said quietly. "If we stay, we don't wake up." They prepared in silence. A small sack of cornmeal, a stolen knife honed thin as truth, and a leather pouch Rue pressed into Zora's hands, filled with roots, grave dirt, and symbols older than the plantation itself. As night swallowed the land and the moon vanished behind heavy clouds, Celia and Zora slipped away. They did not run north like the others. They went east, toward the water, toward the St. John's River, dark and wide, moving like a living thing through the land. "The river has a mouth that doesn't speak," Zora whispered. And together, they stepped into it, letting the current carry them away from the only world they had ever known. The alarm on the Whitmore plantation rose with the sun, but it came later than it should have. Old Isaiah, the keeper of the morning bell, had noticed the empty cabin before first light touched the cotton rows. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at the doorway where Celia and Zora had slept, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't name. In a quiet act of rebellion that history would never record, Isaiah delayed the bell. He coughed. He fumbled with the rope. He wasted time that could never be given back. That single stolen hour became the distance between life and death. When Garrett finally realized they were gone, the plantation erupted into controlled chaos. Horses were saddled. Men shouted orders that overlapped and contradicted each other. But this was no ordinary escape. The Whitmores did not treat it like one. A field hand running was an inconvenience. But the girl frightened them. By midday, they sent for Silas Crenshaw, a name that carried weight across 3 states. Crenshaw was not a patrolman or a local tracker. He was a specialist, a professional hunter of human beings who had turned cruelty into a science. He arrived just before noon, riding a massive, rangy horse, trailing 6 Cuban bloodhounds bred for stamina, aggression, and silence. The dogs' ears dragged the ground. Their noses could pull a scent from rain-soaked earth, and every enslaved person within sight knew what those animals meant. Crenshaw dismounted without ceremony, tall, gaunt, wrapped in oilskin that shed mud and water like armor. His face was sharp and weathered, carved by years of wind and violence, his pale grey eyes flat and lifeless, like a shark's. He listened to Garrett's frantic explanation with bored detachment, scanning the horizon as if the fugitives were already in his sights. "How long?" he asked. When told it had been nearly 8 hours, he didn't flinch. He had caught men with days more than that. Inside Celia's cabin, Crenshaw moved with predatory precision. He lifted Zora's ragdoll from the dirt floor and handed it to the lead hound, Titus. The dog inhaled deeply, then recoiled, sneezing violently, whining, rubbing its snout against the ground as if the scent burned. Crenshaw frowned for the first time. Unease flickered behind his eyes. "Smart runaways go to water," he muttered. "But water only hides you for so long." As the dogs were forced back onto the trail, Crenshaw didn't notice the swamp listening. But it noticed him. The swamp did not welcome Silas Crenshaw. It tolerated him at first, the way nature sometimes allows a wound before deciding whether to heal or fester. The St. John's wetlands swallowed sound, swallowed distance, swallowed certainty, turning pursuit into guesswork and confidence into superstition. Celia felt it the moment her bare feet sank into the mud. A low hum beneath the earth, like something vast had shifted and taken notice. Zora felt it too. She closed her eyes as they moved deeper into the cypress shadows, whispering words Rue had pressed into her memory long before she understood their weight. Behind them, the dogs began to falter. Their perfect formation dissolved as scents twisted and doubled back on themselves, trails folding like snakes eating their own tails. Titus whined again, foam flecking his jaws, his powerful body shuddering as though something unseen tugged at his senses. Crenshaw cursed under his breath, snapping commands, striking the air with his riding crop, but the swamp answered louder than he ever could. Insects swarmed without pattern, birds screamed warnings meant for no human ear, and the ground softened until each step became a negotiation with gravity itself. Zora stopped near a stand of ancient cypress, their roots rising from the water like the knuckles of drowned giants. Celia reached for her, panic tightening her chest, but Zora shook her head slowly, her face calm in a way no child's should have been. "This is where it turns," she said softly. She knelt, pressing her small palms into the black water, drawing a circle with deliberate care. From Rue's pouch, she scattered grave dirt into the current, not to summon death, but to remind the living what waited if balance was broken. The swamp answered immediately. Fog rolled in thick and sudden, cutting sightlines to a few feet. The dogs howled as one, not in hunger but in terror, their voices collapsing into panicked yelps. One by one they broke from the trail, bolting blindly into the brush, leashes snapping, handlers shouting as chaos erupted. Crenshaw stood frozen, his certainty cracking for the first time in decades. He had hunted men, women, children, but this felt like being hunted back. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted. Trees leaned closer, their branches clawing at clothes and skin, drawing blood in thin, deliberate lines. Crenshaw slipped, plunging knee-deep into water that stank of rot and memory, something cold brushing his calf before vanishing beneath the surface. He scrambled up, breath ragged, pulse hammering, every instinct screaming retreat. Miles ahead, Zora rose from the water, eyes dark and focused. The swamp closed behind her, and Silas Crenshaw would never again be certain which way led out. Night fell wrong in the swamp. Too fast, too heavy, as if someone had pulled a curtain across the sky without warning. Celia felt it press against her chest, the darkness thick enough to taste, each breath carrying rot, water, and something older that refused to be named. They should have been exhausted by then, legs trembling, lungs burning, but Zora walked with steady purpose, her small hand warm and sure inside her mother's. Ahead of them the cypress opened into a narrow rise of dry ground, barely more than a spine of earth above the flood. Zora stopped there and waited. Crenshaw came out of the fog like a ghost that hadn't decided whether it belonged to the living or the dead. Gone was the confident hunter on horseback. Gone were the dogs. He stumbled into the clearing soaked, bleeding, his coat torn, eyes wild and bloodshot, breathing like a man who had run from something he could not outrun. The swamp had stripped him down to fear and stubbornness, and still he reached for his rifle. "Step aside, woman," he rasped, voice cracking as if the air itself resisted him. "This ends now." Celia moved instinctively, placing herself in front of Zora, her body remembering a lifetime of punishment meant for moments like this. Her hands shook, but she did not step back. Zora did. She slipped past her mother gently, almost tenderly, and stood barefoot on the wet ground between them. She was small, mud-streaked, barely more than a shadow against the dark. But when she lifted her eyes to meet Crenshaw's, the swamp went silent. No insects, no frogs, no wind through the trees. Crenshaw froze. His finger locked around the trigger, but his body refused the command. The rifle trembled, then sagged, as if it had suddenly grown too heavy to hold. "You," he whispered, recognition breaking through the terror. "I've seen you before." Zora spoke softly, not shouting, not chanting, just words placed carefully into the night. "You followed what wasn't yours," she said. You stepped where you were warned not to walk. Her voice carried, not loud, but complete, filling the space between heartbeats. The water behind Crenshaw rippled, slow, deliberate. Something large shifted beneath the surface, unseen but unmistakably present. Crenshaw backed away, boots slipping, breath hitching as the ground betrayed him inch by inch. "No," he gasped, shaking his head, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "I'll go, I swear." Zora tilted her head slightly, considering him the way one might consider a cracked vessel. Then she lowered her gaze, and the swamp exhaled. Crenshaw's scream did not last long. The fog closed. The water swallowed sound, and by the time Celia dared to look again, there was nothing left of the hunter but ripples fading into stillness. Zora turned back to her mother, eyes clear, voice small once more. "It's done," she said, and the swamp let them pass. Dawn came softly over the swamp, not like a victory, not like a trumpet call, but like a promise kept quietly between the earth and those who listened. The fog thinned into pale ribbons, lifting just enough to reveal a narrow stretch of solid ground beyond the water, a place where the trees stood farther apart and the air no longer pressed down on the lungs. Celia collapsed there, knees giving way at last. The weight of fear, flight, and years of survival finally allowed to break her open. She cried without sound, hands buried in the soil, alive in a way she had never been permitted to feel before. Zora stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the sun rise as if she had seen it many times already in dreams. Behind them, the swamp sealed itself, fog thickening once more, erasing tracks, memories, and the last proof that Silas Crenshaw had ever existed. The land had taken its payment, and it was satisfied. They never returned to the plantation world, moving only at night, guided by those who recognized the signs Rue had taught. They followed hidden paths north and east, through free black settlements that existed like constellations, unmapped, fragile, and fiercely protected. Some said Union soldiers helped them. Others said the river itself carried them where they needed to go. Celia never corrected anyone. Years later, people began whispering about a woman who healed without touch, who spoke to the land and was answered, who protected runaways by turning paths crooked and hunters blind. They called her many names: Root Woman, Swamp Witch, Guardian, but never Monster. And if you walk the St. John's River at dawn, when the fog moves wrong and the water goes still as glass, some swear you can see a young girl standing barefoot at the edge, watching the trees like old friends, waiting, not to harm, but to warn. This is Haunted Corridors, and some freedom stories are written not in ink, but in fear, blood, and the land remembering who it belongs to.